This is episode 30 of the Women in Depth podcast. The information found in this podcast is not a substitute for help from a licensed mental health professional. Hi, and welcome back to the Women in Depth podcast. Today we are going to be talking about a topic, a phenomenon that is fascinating to many, misunderstood, not really talked about, makes people uncomfortable, and is perhaps even feared. And that is the experience or phenomenon of BDSM. The letters stand for bondage, discipline, or domination, submission, and masochism. And there is a lot of confusion, misinformation around this topic. And for many, their ideas around BDSM come from the media and from movies like 50 Shades of Grey. Today, Karine Hay will shine some light on this area that is typically hidden beneath the surface, not talked about, and considered taboo. She will clarify the myths around BDSM and answer questions that many have around this compelling, misrepresented, and misunderstood topic. Hi, and welcome back to the podcast. Today, our guest is Karine Hay. Coreen is a visiting faculty member in the Marriage and Family Therapy program at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, teaching for UNLV since 2007. She has considerable experience presenting and instructing on clinical work with non-traditional families, as well as sex therapy, sexual issues, crisis suicide risk assessment, language and diversity, diagnosis, LGBTQ studies, kink-friendly psychotherapy, and gender and sexuality. She is a clinical fellow and approved supervisor of the MFT and is also a member of the American Counseling Association. Currently, Coreen is pursuing her PhD in counselor education at Adams State University and is also a licensed marriage and family therapist with a small private practice in Las Vegas, Nevada. Coreen works primarily with gender and sexuality, as well as families and individuals from non-traditional family structures. Hi, Coreen, and welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Lourdes. Thank you for having me.
So today we're talking about an experience, something that many people wonder about, explore, have made, I would say, judgments about.
Yes.
And I think there's probably a lot of misinformation out there that, for better or for worse, can really, I think, send out different ideas, or I guess just people just kind of come away with it with probably a lot of misinformation.
Generally, that's the case, yes,
Yeah.
if there hasn't been extra education around it, absolutely.
Yeah, and today our topic is really going beneath the surface and getting a informed understanding of BDSM. So before we jump into this, I wanted to ask you to share why the area of BDSM has become a focal point for you, how you were perhaps called to work in this area or research it.
Well, one of the main reasons I was called to this area is because of my own personal involvement throughout my life with it, which is obviously the case for a lot of people who either research or serve the communities they're a part of. So one of the reasons that I wanted to work more in this area is because I did have, as well, a lot of work with non-traditional family forms, such as people with more than one partner, poly situations, as well as polygamous and polyamorous situations, as well as LGBTQ community and everybody there. So I felt like this also, I noticed, was difficult for people to get therapy. I noticed that when people would come in who were a part of the BDSM community to get therapy, they were experiencing the same kind of issues that other minoritized and disenfranchised populations were experiencing, including a lot of misunderstanding, miseducation, and discrimination, particularly from the mental health fields as well. Slowly that's changing, and right now we're in the process of writing a literature review on what we're looking at in kink research and BDSM research in the mental health field now, as opposed to what was done in the past. And there's currently a big movement and a big switchover happening in the research around basically consensual BDSM. BDSM is always consensual, but I only say that for the purpose of this interview because I feel that there may be some misinformation as we go forward. So I wanted to put that out there right away. But yeah, there's a lot of interest in it. The other interest I have is I have a lot of interest in power dynamics in general. Power dynamics is a very, very important part of couples therapy. And when we look at power dynamics within couples therapy and we look at power dynamics within a social justice context, it's really interesting to see how deeply power dynamics can play out in other contexts, whereas in BDSM, it becomes more on the table and more overt and much more consensual. And that's just a general overview of why I may have gotten involved in this.
And you've touched on some of these already, but
sure.
Why is it important for the world in general, and especially mental health clinicians and perhaps those exploring or participating in the BDSM world? Why is it important to have this information out there? Why does it matter?
Well, I would say that's for therapists and people in the mental health world, it's critically important. And then I'll talk a second about the general population as well. But for people who are in service professions, whether it be mental health, general practitioner, physician, anyone in a service profession, it's critically important, particularly in therapy, that we understand as many types of communities, as many types of diverse experiences as possible. Unfortunately, there's been so much misinformation out there around this particular community and around these particular practices that even therapists don't always have the information. So at bare minimum, a therapist needs to provide the safest place they can possibly provide. When people go into a therapist's office, and I'm sure like you would realize this as well as a therapist, is that the very first thing they're hoping for is a non-judgmental atmosphere for maybe the first time in their life. And so when someone comes into a therapist's office, regardless of what the presenting issue is, because sometimes the presenting issue is simply anxiety. And so when people come into my office and they happen to be practitioners of BDSM, or more so, it's a complete lifestyle for them. It's more of a 24/7 lifestyle for them. It's really critical that I don't make them feel less than, misunderstood, or minoritized, or disenfranchised in any way in a therapist's office. That's what they deal with in the outside world all the time. And that's pretty much any minoritized community. And this just happens to be another one. The myths out there, I'm sure we'll talk about that later, are pretty strong. So number one is that a good therapist ideally will provide a non-judgmental space. Now, every therapist is not going to be educated in every cultural arena, obviously, but it's critically important to keep ourselves as informed as possible, particularly when you do provide sex therapy, as many MFTs do, that this is not as uncommon as people think. The research is out there, but just like we found in a lot of queer situations, there's a closeting that goes on. Same with consensual non-monogamy, where people won't share this in the outside world for fear of judgment. We don't want that to happen in a therapy office. Additionally, if you go in and talk about this to your therapist and your therapist responds with a bunch of classic myths, your client's not going to return. They're not going to feel like they can get to the anxiety or the other issues they may be wanting to deal with because they have to weed through a lot of extra BS, right, basically, in order to educate the therapist. And nobody likes to be educating their therapist when you're actually paying the therapist to help you. I mean, although all therapy is a give and take, and of course there's a process, it is part of our responsibility to keep up on the research and understand this. Now, as people out there in the world as well, I think it's important for people to understand this simply because the misunderstanding that anything in BDSM is non-consensual, abusive, is a big problem. What ends up happening is people who participate in this with unbelievable amounts of consent and unbelievable amount of overt negotiation and care and kindness and assuring everybody's having a safe, or as safe as possible experience and informed consent. These are the risks that may be here. More so done in this community than any community I've ever experienced or researched, that if people are thinking that this is that the abuse is what's going on, when the core aspect of abuse is non-consensual power dynamic and non-consensual activities and non-consensual manipulation. So it really is the opposite of what people are doing in BDSM. And so from a social justice perspective, there's a lot of judgment and hiding for people who participate in this kind of, some people call it, and we do call it in the BDSM community, we call it play. And often for a lot of people, it's much more than play. But that's critically why it's important, is to understand and to not jump forward into assumptions when people don't really know a whole lot about this, particularly with 50 Shades. If that's all we're getting, then we really don't understand. So yes.
I think, you said so much good stuff there, and I was ready to respond to so many of it, but I'm just going to kind of reflect back what stood out for me. And I think one of them was just how you shared about the power dynamics, because really, I think people forget that they are present in every relationship. And,
oh, yes.
Yeah. And so I think that was really important to bring up. It's not just something that happens in BDSM, it's everywhere. And collectively, it's everywhere.
Yes.
And so,
yes.
Yeah.
And primarily in BDSM, the biggest difference is that it's overt and consensual. And yeah, I mean, the power dynamics in BDSM are not just, I think people have an idea of just the using the belt or the flogger and beating somebody. And that's one activity in a very, very large and varied amount of activities that people enjoy that include power exchange.
Yeah. I love how you made that distinction that it's overt in the BDSM world, whereas in other relationships, collectively, it's not. And so that also leads to a lot of, I think, challenges,
Yeah. And as we know, as therapists, this can lead to abuse as well. I mean, when you have a non-consensual or implied power dynamic that hasn't really been discussed, it does open the doors for abusive situations.
And then I also loved that just how you, really described what, as a therapist or a counselor, the most basic thing that, we provide is that place of safety, and it needs to begin there. And the rest, you will learn as you go, even though, like you said, we also bring our knowledge base to the therapeutic encounter. I think the most important thing is being able to show up and receive and be open to what your clients bring.
And we know that's accurate from the research.
Yeah.
We know that the primary, almost prerequisite to doing any good work in therapy is having a positive relationship with your therapist.
Yeah.
That's not the only thing that's important, but without that, nothing much can happen in a therapeutic situation. So.
Yeah. And, and also too, just to add to that, regardless of a therapist's orientation, their approach to therapy, the letters behind their name, the one factor that always connects, what is a meaningful and beneficial therapeutic experience for the client, it's that relationship with the therapist.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that we all know and agree that. I mean, psychiatrists, psychologists, licensed clinical social workers, MFTs, LCPs. I mean, they're LCPCs or LPCs. They're all the levels of therapy. I think we all understand that basic component of what we do as being the most critical condition.
So I think, to begin with, maybe we can start with just some basic stuff like definitions.
Sure. Let's do it.
So what is BDSM? And maybe with this, you can go into the letters.
Yeah, sure. Okay. So BDSM is an overarching umbrella term. And I do a lot of study around language and what that means for people. And this is current. So literally after you listen to this interview, this could be altering. So things change quickly in language, and I want people to be aware of that. But currently, many people either use the word kink or BDSM to define an umbrella of all activities that are power exchange or power dynamics where that plays a large part of it. Mostly it's sexual, but in some cases it's not. And so I want to make that very clear that the sexuality is only one part of the BDSM world. B stands for bondage. D stands for either domination or discipline. S stands for submission and or sadism, and M stands for masochism. So I think that this came from a long time ago. People just said S&M, sadism and masochism. I'm into S&M. What's ironic about that now is that when you look at the larger kink community, and there are people within the kink community who don't like the word kink because they say that, well, that implies sexuality. So like I said, there's a lot of controversy around these titles, but as of now, BDSM or power exchange are probably the best terms for it. So bondage, here's the thing, is bondage is one piece of BDSM, or some people sadism. I get excited or enjoy inflicting what looks like pain to other people. Now, to the submissive or bottom, it very rarely feels like actual pain that we consider pain in that respect, like something we don't want to happen, something we shy away from. It can almost be likened to, hey, when we feel really sad, that can be painful. But we know that for healthy reasons, we need to embrace sadness, feel it, go through that pain. And so there's a consensual nature of pain for purpose. And there's also the fact that once pain is not always interpreted by the brain in the same way as we're perceiving it on the outside world. So pain is a big concept I can get into in a little bit about how that's different. But the masochism is, of course, the finding pleasure in the receiving of pain. Again, pain being defined in a very specific way. So bondage is only one aspect of the larger kink world. Some people enjoy it, some people do not. It's one category in a very, very large tree of power exchange type of activities. The submission and domination is probably the most critical part, and discipline. Domination and submission is something that we deal with in our everyday lives all the time. How we're dealing with it, how overt it is, and how much we've thought about what's happening, how consensual these things are, is a whole different issue. In the BDSM community, there's a lot of focus on bringing this to the table, making sure we're very clear about who's in charge when and how to remove that permission if need be, making sure the person who's bottom or submissive is as safe as possible, everything is consensual. So the dominance and submission has a lot more to do with power exchange, consensual power exchange for the purposes of pleasure, for the purposes of growth, for the purposes of emotional satisfaction. And there's even some research coming out to show that some of these power exchange, very, very vulnerable, intimate activities and moments can actually involve a lot of personal growth. And many people are seeing this as a path to spirituality and self-understanding as well.
Can you share a little bit more can you expound on that, on maybe about how this experience of extreme vulnerability actually can lead to closer intimacy or even growth?
So, as we know, extreme intimacy is going to lead to growth for most people in general. The most vulnerable we can be, and a lot of us have seen the video by Brené Brown about the power of vulnerability, and fantastic TED Talk. But this has been around. This is not a new concept for a long time. In order to make ourselves naked, if you will, whether that be physically, emotionally, spiritually, in order to make ourselves naked and vulnerable, we have to be at the highest levels of trust. And when two or more people can engage in any kind of activity where they're at the highest level of trust, emotions, feelings, thoughts, all kinds of intimate feelings can come up and arise through that are not always achieved in any other way, except for at our most vulnerable point. Many people just look at sex in general as being extraordinarily vulnerable, and I would agree. Not only are we physically without our clothes to, some degree, not always, not completely. Sometimes there's clothes, sometimes a little clothes, but there's some level of vulnerability, right? Right. So in a sexual encounter, there's always some level of vulnerability. But I think in these encounters, that's deepened. I think that there's potential for a lot of altered states. And now we have research to show that many of the activities in BDSM actually bring us to altered states. And these altered states can be places where many people have reported something akin to a spiritual experience, bliss, ecstasy, and a lot of self-growth. A lot of, wow, now I know more about myself. Now I want to sit and talk with who I've been playing with and come down from this experience. So we now know that certain levels, particularly if there is pain, particularly if there's bondage incorporated, that our brains react to pain by creating many different receptors are activated. But we all know that endorphins are natural pain receptors, that immediately endorphins go into their action. Once endorphins mimic morphine, they mimic painkillers. So when you're actually engaging in what your brain may perceive as some sort of flogging or something like that, what can happen to both the dominant and submissive in the situation, or I should say bottom and top, because it's not always the same, is that you can be taken to kind of a different altered state. And that's often called subspace. So during that time, you are in a very vulnerable and trusting position, and it can open up pathways that wouldn't normally be there during that time.
I like how you brought in the connection between vulnerability and safety, because you can't have one without the other. You can't be vulnerable unless you do feel safe. And so that's really an interesting aspect of this, because it's overt about the level or degree of vulnerability here again. And maybe that's another part of this experience that is really different and hard for others to see, because in the, I guess, external world and other more acceptable, traditional, relational and sexual exchanges, that vulnerability is kind of like this abstract thing that only maybe comes up in therapy, right?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it is just an abstract concept for a lot of people, and there's no continuum in their mind about what that looks like and how powerful it can be at your deepest, most vulnerable. And let me be perfectly clear, there is no such thing as a completely safe environment or safe space. But I think that the idea of feeling safe is critical. But why does a person feel safe? Right. I mean, for example, if we talk about feeling safe with a person, well, we can, why do you feel unsafe with a person? Why do you feel safe with another? That may or may not be directly related to threat. But I would say that, one of the credos that the credo we used to go by in the BDSM community was safe, sane, and consensual, which sounded great. We want everything to be safe, we want everything to be sane, and we want everything to be consensual. And now it's been altered. First of all, what is sane? Right? That's a very difficult concept to achieve, where all of a sudden there's some level of insanity. So that kind of was thrown out. The other thing is nothing is completely safe. Any sexual experience is not going to be completely safe emotionally, spiritually, or physically, regardless, whether it's BDSM or not. So the idea of making it as safe as environment as possible and putting consent back into the hands of many, not just between two people behind closed doors. And that's a critical piece of the community as well. That consent, negotiation, and safety, the idea of safety, is a community event. It's a community push. It's not just between two people. And that does speak to why it's important for us to have a community to talk to and share with, because in order to get involved in BDSM at certain levels, you do need education around things, depending on what activity you're participating in.
Coreen, could you expound a little bit more? You had mentioned earlier that you would go into this a little bit more in depth about the experience of pain.
Yeah. So our brains are the ones that interpret pain, right? As a matter of fact, in most of our centers in the brain, if we were to just do an MRI or that sort of thing, or an EEG, we wouldn't know the difference between pleasure and pain. We really can't see that it looks the same when people are experiencing extreme pleasure or extreme pain. Additionally, the sounds we make when we're in extreme pain or pleasure are also the same. So there's a lot of research right now looking at the connections between pleasure and pain and what are those connections, because as of now, we can't tell the difference in brain activity between those two things, which is ironic and interesting. As we know, if we get numbed out somewhere, right, we go to the dentist and we get numbed, we're not going to process that as pain, yet the exact same event is still taking place because the area has been numbed. So there's a lot of pain processing components. And we also know that people talk about different tolerances to pain. You've heard about that, I'm sure. I have a high tolerance to pain, I have a low tolerance to pain. It's a subjective experience. Obviously, there's some objective pieces that people agree upon, but it is a very subjective experience. And depending upon the levels of pain that the person, for many people, you'll hear somebody say, well, no, that felt good to me. Well, no, that felt like pain to me. So again, it's a subjective experience and it changes. When people do flogging in BDSM, it's often common to start with low levels of flogging. As a matter of fact, people who have never seen BDSM, when I observe people I recently went to a dungeon where new people had never seen this before, and somebody leaned over to me and was like, "Is this it? Is this it? Is this all they do?" And I had to giggle because when you actually go into a consensual BDSM dungeon, yeah, you're going to see a lot of different things. But in general, it doesn't look nearly as horrible as the idea in that person's head. There's very soft flogging. There's a lot of touching, checking in with the bottom, making sure they're okay. I mean, it's not exactly what people envision, which is what people are envisioning is a fantasy a lot more than what's actually happening in reality.
Yeah.
So, and not everybody wants to make their fantasies reality, while some do want to act some of those fantasies out, or somebody wants to act a fantasy out and then realizes halfway through, and I've seen this happen many times, just scenes gone wrong. Like everybody starts laughing, it's not going to work, and I wouldn't even say it's gone wrong because everybody learns, okay, this is why this didn't work for me. Somebody said this thing and I burst out laughing, and I just, I couldn't do that. That I thought it would turn me on, but instead it just took me out of it. Right. Ha 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 ha. So
that's funny.
So yeah, yeah, and just like in regular sex. And if you think about the idea of pain, is that many, many, many people have had a hickey or have given a hickey.
Yeah.
And officially, it's supposed to hurt a little, but it leaves a little bruise, a little mark on your neck, usually. But interestingly enough, this is an accepted form of bruising. This is an accepted form of pain because as a society, we say, oh, that's just a thing. Right. That's not a big deal. When it is somewhere on the continuum of kink behavior. Yeah, and there's a great new article, Unusual Sexual Fantasies. I can't remember the name of the entire article, but it does talk about that these unusual sexual fantasies, the research was done, they're not that unusual at all. So we are definitely getting there in the research. And it's not just I know people definitely think of it these days, especially as a male is a top and a female is a bottom. And that is definitely not always the case at all in our world. As a matter of fact, I'm not even sure if that's the majority.
So I think this is actually a natural place to shift into what are some of the myths or misperceptions about BDSM that you have come across in your studies and experience.
So I've heard a lot of different myths and misconceptions throughout the years. Generally, it's due to, in the past, mental health literature focused only in on a paraphilia, which was looked at as some sort of highly uncommon sexual expression. And unfortunately, all the research that was generally done was done on prison inmates, people who were dealing with these non-consensual sexual acts. Interestingly enough, in the DSM, we have something in there like in our paraphilia section, something as ridiculous as transvestic fetishism. Yet we don't have something in there that actually is sexually violent to me, which would be a more consistent diagnosis, but that's another issue. So the myths definitely started in, I think, within mental health, and of course, just general assumptions that people make about things they don't know much about that we all kind of do naturally until we unlearn the assumptions and learn what's really going on. So certainly in the community now and in education, we've been talking, and in research, we've been talking about what's called the 50 Shades effect, which is some of the most common misconceptions about kink. So Nichols had done an article on, focusing in and highlighting some of the most common misconceptions about kink. And through the research in 2006, she found about 7 of the most common myths. Interestingly enough, all of them were in 50 Shades of Grey, all of them.
Oh, wow.
Which is why it was unfortunate. 50 Shades is a mixed bag because we were like, great, people are going to know more about us and who we are. Unfortunately, they learned this. So now we have to unteach. But so the most these are the common myths that she found in her research. BDSM is mostly about the dominant partner getting their way with a passive exploited submissive. BDSM is always about physical pain. Another one was, this is interesting and still out there, BDSM activities inevitably escalate to extremes, become addictive and unsafe.
Wow. BDSM
is self-destructive. That one, I only giggle about that because of the insane focus on self-growth in this community. BDSM stems from childhood abuse. BDSM is an avoidance of intimacy, and BDSM is completely different from what we call vanilla sex. And vanilla sex is the term for kind of your everyday average sex that doesn't necessarily include an overt power exchange or BDSM activity. So the first myth about the dominant partner getting away with a passive exploited submissive, we saw a lot of that in 50 Shades. He stalked her. It was ridiculous in a lot of ways. So what's really going on is you have dominants, you have submissives, you have people who are switches, you have tops, you have bottoms, and those things are not always exactly the same. You could actually have what's called, for example, a service top. Somebody who is a top, but they are actually the more submissive one, or they wouldn't say submissive in the activity, but they'd say, okay, what is it that you want me to do to you for your pleasure? And so it's really the dominant partner has the ultimate responsibility, but the submissive has a lot of responsibility too. What's happening is there's a dominant generally who says, this is something I want to do. And then you have a submissive who says, this is also something I want to do. And if they match up, they sit down, they negotiate about what exactly they want to do, what they're okay with, what they're not okay with. There's a lot that goes into negotiation. Then, of course, negotiation includes safe words responsibility. And safe words alone are not the only way to stop a scene. There are many, many, many ways and safeguards put in place on how to stop a scene, particularly if maybe your mouth is gagged or something that's part of the fantasy that you want to try. But yet you need to have another way to say slow down or stop or keep going. I really like that.
Right.
So we don't use that in kind of everyday average sex. And that would be great if we did.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that one, the submissive actually has, in general, people agree the submissive will actually have more power in most of those situations because they're having things often done to them. And in that situation, they're the ones who can put the brakes on more easily. Although I watch responsible dominants will continuously check in. BDSM is about physical pain? Not always. It's about power exchange. So that may or may not include pain. And it's not the kind of, if it doesn't feel good in some way, then there's absolutely no reason that people should be engaging. So this is people when they're getting flogged or things are happening or any kind of pain. These are things that the person who's experiencing the bottom position is enjoying, asking for, wanting. And so it's not always about physical pain. Additionally, what might be painful to one person is not painful to another. And if you think back to your childhood, anybody who's listening right now, I'm sure you can think about all the physical pain games that we all played as children, from those two fingers on the side of your, arm, your forearm, to the hitting your knuckles with decks of cards, even putting your fingers in those, what do they call the Chinese handcuffs, when you put your fingers in those. I mean, all of these things that we did, there's a natural inclination sometimes to explore this. Another myth that the activities escalate to extremes and become addictive. There is zero evidence to support that. And some people say, I have a spanking fetish, and that's all they ever do. So we don't really have any research to deny or support that. But there's literally what we're focusing at right now is that we need to look at, are people's activities changing or quote unquote escalating? What does escalating even mean? Is this common in sex in general, et cetera? And addictive, that's really a reach. Even sex addiction is kind of controversial in some respects. BDSM being self-destructive, that's just a generalized assumption. Again, what we find in the research so far is that people who are practicing BDSM, actually, it's the opposite. In some areas, it looks like they're doing a little bit better. In some areas, as a matter of fact, women in the BDSM world are a little less rejection sensitive. Men seem to have less instances of premature ejaculation, and women have less issues with anorgasmia. There's a whole bunch of stuff out there. Now, I'm not saying that BDSM practitioners are inherently better people, but there's a construct within BDSM which involves high levels of overt communication, high levels of consent, discussion, negotiation, and high levels of self-growth. And we don't necessarily see that as an automatic in nuclear families. We don't see that as an automatic in other communities. the idea that BDSM stems from childhood abuse, we have a little bit of research out there right now, and we have zero evidence to support that. It looks like childhood abuse was the same in the general population as it was in people who participate. BDSM is an avoidance of intimacy? Absolutely not. As a matter of fact, people report much higher levels of intimacy. And the idea that BDSM is separate from vanilla sex, when that's not the case. There are many people who enjoy BDSM sex, but also love to have vanilla sex as well, depending on who their partner is. Or maybe they have more than one partner. It's not a separate thing. It's a large, big, fat continuum. So that was like a quickie once over on the myths.
So, Coreen, just a couple of questions that kind of came to mind as you were sharing those myths. And you mentioned this earlier, and maybe if you could just go into this a little bit more. You said that under this umbrella of BDSM, there are actually activities that are not sexual.
Yes. And I would say not just the activities that are not sexual, but the relationship. Like, for example, spanking, to use that as an example. For many people, that could be very sexual, even though there's no sex involved, right?
Right.
So a spanking for some people could be for example, there could be a relationship between two people that's a non-sexual BDSM relationship where somebody is in service to another person. They have possibly a contracted negotiation, and there may be spankings and all of that, but it's a non-sexual relationship. So what they're getting out of the relationship is something beyond sexual. Okay. Which gets very deep, to be honest. We need a whole other hour to talk about some of those intimate relationships. And there's some amazing people out there. Antoinette Izzo, who she is a PhD student in anthropology here at UNLV, and also very outspoken about this. And she was able to explain in a deep detail about non-sexual BDSM relationships. So, but yeah, they can definitely be a non-sexual. I would say the majority of them are because people are turned on by certain activities. So certainly an activity can be sexual or not, but I guess that's the best way to explain it.
Okay. And then another question that I had was, you mentioned earlier that this could also be a lifestyle. Can you go into that a little bit more?
Yeah. And as some people are triggered by the word lifestyle, both in and out of the community. But what we mean by that is that there's a discussion I wouldn't say conflict, but an interesting discussion about what is BDSM to people. Is it more like a sexual orientation? I've known this since I was 3. I've always known I've wanted this. Or is it more like serious leisure? We're playing and having a wonderful time and I love it and I have to have some training to do it, just like golf or, things like that. Like people would say, I can't imagine my life without golf. But to what degree? Some people love golf every day. Some people are like, I can go every couple months. So there's a discussion about that whole idea. The issue is that for some people, I do believe it's a sexual orientation, and for some people, it's casual or serious leisure. Absolutely, mostly serious leisure. So, and this can cross over with different people. So many people will call themselves 24/7. Okay, so what does that mean? That means that they're involved in one or more relationships, that there is a power dynamic that is 24/7. That is more of a lifestyle type relationship. Again, with the disclaimer that this language can change very quickly. But when we talk about lifestyle, there are people and members of the community. What does that mean? Are they out at events, those sorts of things, or not? But a lifestyle is usually translated to me and my partner or partners live in a 24 situation, dominant and submissive pattern. That can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but it's usually at a 24/7. Other people may not do 24/7, but may say that like, oh, we're still part of the lifestyle, or we'll live the lifestyle when we can. We do this on the weekends. That's kind of how the term is used. Understand that in a 24/7 lifestyle, that does not mean you're a slave forever. It's over. It means that just like anything else, you've made a commitment, and a good master, a good dominant, and a good relationship, there will be a continual check-in of negotiation to make sure everyone in the relationship is fulfilled and getting what they want and need out of it in a healthy way.
Coreen, what do you think the world in general, or those who maybe are not a part of the BDSM lifestyle or in that world, what do you think the BDSM experience has to offer or can teach those who are not in that experience?
Okay. Wow. Great question. Several things. And again, I don't think that it's a personal difference between the people involved and not, but what rises in the culture of the community. The first thing I would say that the general population can learn from BDSM practitioners is the insane amount of communication that goes on around sex and sexuality. I teach sexual behavior, and I have since at least 1991 in some contexts, but at UNLV for many, many years, as some other universities as well. And people have a hard time talking about sex at all, period.
Oh, yeah.
It's
Right. Yeah.
It's a very hard thing for people to talk about. But in this community, in this world, it is the language, the words, the discussion about it no longer is taboo. And slowly it becomes a very comfortable topic, more quickly for some. But the wonderful thing about having this accepted overt communication in sexuality is that everything is safer, whether you're involved in BDSM or not. And when I say that, I mean emotionally safer. There are sexual assaults that happen within the confines of relationships. As a matter of fact, they're very common in those. But without communication, we may not even realize that that's happened to us. There's a lot of frustration in the outside world around talking about sex. So that's the first thing, is communication. I mean, the communication, and then to expand upon that is the communication around consent. We don't really care for implied consent in the BDSM community. Now, this is, again, a controversial discussion about the nature of consent. It is not as simple as a cup of tea. It's just not. Obviously, when you're having sex with somebody, you're not asking them every step of the moment, right? You're not saying, may I touch your breasts? Okay, great. Now may I touch your hips? We're not doing that. So what does that mean? What point of consent is implied and what is informed? Well, the BDSM world prefers informed consent. And negotiations around activities and within and without relationships are very, very, very critical. So there are trainings and conferences and activities and community and what we call munches, where we can just chill out and go to Denny's or, well, in Vegas, we go to a bar, but in most places, munches are just restaurants, someone's home, where you're just casual and you're just talking, getting to know each other. But there's lots and lots of activities and conferences where we can learn how to do these things safely. And one of the main kind of workshops we do is around how to negotiate consent. If the outside world could understand more about communication and consent, we might have a lot less problems with our younger people. We might have a lot of around communication, and we might have a lot less problems with sexual assault. Now, that's kind of a jump, and I'm not saying that's for sure. And I don't think communication is the reason people get assaulted. People get assaulted because somebody wants to assault them, and that is the only person to blame. But I definitely feel that there's all kinds of subtleties around consent that are really, they're better hashed out ahead of time. And I think that there's an assumption that if we talk about sex, it loses its mystery. Quite the opposite. Talking about sex actually makes people a little bit more turned on. Well, if I, draw out the whole fantasy ahead of time, it's going to lose its luster. Nope. I'm here to tell you it doesn't most of the time. And every sexual encounter is not going to be perfect. Every intimate encounter is not going to be perfect. But I do think that the insane, I keep using the word insane, but it's because it's such, it's a lot. I'm not sure to say the better way to say that, but there's so much focus on caring, consent, communication, caution. And those are the 4 C's that were written about in the research, I believe, by DJ Williams as well. So it's, like I said, we moved from safe, sane, and consensual to what's now called RAC, the RAC concept, the risk-aware consensual kink. If you go skydiving, you talk a lot about what's going to happen beforehand.
Right.
You sign contracts. You talk about what the risks are. There are risks, but you do them in an aware and consensual way. We don't do that with regular sexuality. So I think there's a lot to be learned there. And we're starting to see that there's a lot of self-growth through what some people are talking about as the spiritual aspect of BDSM. So those are big pieces.
Yeah, I was just to kind of follow up on what you shared about the negotiation and the consent and your example of, it sounds a little silly, but can I touch your breast? Can I touch your hip? Not that it has to be that broken down, but you can see, for example, just even with young young adults or teens.
Yes.
And also for the person who, neither one knows that we can talk about this and we can check in to see if what I'm doing is okay, if it's going too fast for you, if it feels good. And both people can feel like they're not strange or weird for talking about it. I mean, it just seems so, in a way, like so basic, right? But
when you say it out loud, it sounds really basic, but talking about sexuality and talking about these things is not the norm for most people.
Well, and even as a therapist, when I ask that question.
Oh, yeah, regardless. Mm-hmm.
When you ask a couple, so how's your sex life? It's very difficult. And it's difficult to talk about, what they like and what turns them on. There's almost just this, we'll just do what I guess people say is okay to do. And we'll just kind of do that over and over again and never really discuss it. So that's very interesting concept that you shared about the BDSM experience. Could you go a little bit more into what you mean by spirituality?
Yeah. And it's again, I'm using the best word I can to describe this. Many people regard it as spiritual. Other people just regard it as some sort of altered experience. Some people actually refer to it as God. But I think that people are, because of the altered experience, because of the altered state that can come from flogging, bondage, or a lot of different emotional engagement and physical engagement in certain activities. Once you feel safe with the person you're playing with, and we do call it playing, or the people that you're playing with, and you're able to reach those states, people have found themselves to kind of have that all-knowing feeling, feel like they're one with the world, one with the universe, one with God. And we do hear that a lot, that people have had those kind of experiences, whether they're topping or bottoming. Additionally, there's a wonderful new article, it's not that new, but there's a wonderful article written about kink as psychotherapy, because as a result of some of those experiences, people have tapped into places deep inside their emotion and cognition that they may have not tapped into without the experience. And they're finding issues coming up that they can then take into therapy or take into support groups or those sorts of things to process. So it's pretty cool what's actually happening.
Coreen, as we wrap up, would you be able to share 2 or 3 suggestions or tips for those who are possibly curious about BDSM? And then 2 or 3 tips for therapists who would like to be able to support those who are experiencing BDSM.
Absolutely. So let's start with people who are interested. Maybe the same people, but we'll see. So people who are interested, couple things that I would say: don't operate in a vacuum. It's very attractive still, because people still have shame around having these kind of fantasies. And myself, I understand that, especially as a feminist and a multicultural feminist and a post-colonial feminist, and particularly with women of color, there's a lot of baggage that will come along with wanting to be in a submissive situation. And so regardless, male, female, or any other gender, the submissive position always needs to be a consensual one and always needs to be from a place of empowerment. It's critically important that if you're operating, the problem is with operating in a vacuum and just watching YouTube videos is that you're kind of not operating in the safest possible way. I highly recommend getting involved with local community if you have one. And if not, try to travel to your nearest city and go to what's called a munch. And that you can have discussions. Nobody's trying to hit on you. I mean, that's not the idea. I can't guarantee that. But you go to a munch, you talk to people, get involved, and try not to jump into activity before seeing who's around and where you feel comfortable. I would suggest reading a lot. Checking out a lot of resources. One of the best resources is going to be the National Coalition for Sexual Freedom. And I particularly like the Arizona Power Exchange and the way that they operate there. They have wonderful publications on consent, negotiation, excellent research. And the National Coalition for Sexual Freedom is on the website. You can find The books you should read, if you're interested: Sexual Outsiders, brand new book by Ortman and Sprott, lots of experience in the community and mental health professionals. SM 101 by Wiseman is classic. Different Loving is classic. Screw the Roses, Send Me the Thorns. These are all classic books that will help you kind of understand how things are working. So instead of just running into the community and running to the first person that seems attractive, it's a little better to find out who you're around. The other thing that's very important in the community is we do our own vetting. So if somebody has not respected consent and it's been intentional and it hasn't been processed, then it's important that that person not be around anymore. And again, consent in the BDSM world is moving toward, and Meg John Barker had explained this in some of the research that they were doing as well, that it's really critical that consent be moved to the community, not just between two people, because you can see how complicated that can get. The next thing I would say to do is really make sure that if you want to play with anybody, that if you feel comfortable enough to do it in a public play space with people you trust, so that you feel more safe. So those are, the other thing I would say is FetLife. FetLife.com is kind of a social networking place for the BDSM world. You will have a lot of people who may be predators who may use it, so you need to be very aware of that as well. But FetLife in general is a really good place to kind of bop around and kind of see what some of the community is doing, what people are saying. It's a fun place to explore fetishes. It's a fun place to explore. It's not necessarily all educational, but certainly I would put that more to National Coalition for Sexual Freedom, but certainly a good place to explore. Now for therapists, that's a whole different deal. At this point, I would say be looking up research. I would say the first thing we do to be competent in a cultural manner is to get educated, right? So in any kind of cultural competency or cultural sensitivity, which this certainly falls under for anyone in the mental health professionals, is read and get educated with the same methods that I just mentioned. But I would also say that, don't misrepresent yourself in any way, but talk to people in the community. Have a panel in your class. Ask people about it. Talk to people who've been doing it for a really long time. Do the research. There's amazing research out there now. I do, and other people are doing trainings and practices. There's conferences, very, very large conferences that you can also learn a little bit about. I will say that the conferences are primarily for people within the community, but that there is also other situations. You can go to Quad S, the conference they have every year, which is what's Quad S? The Society for the Scientific Study of Sexuality. So that's kind of my home base. But there's lots of wonderful information there around BDSM. The other organization that you might want to understand, and you can go to you can go to a conference for, is great. It's called CARAS, CARAS, and that's the Consortium for Academic Research and Alternative Sexualities, and they deal with kink and consensual non-monogamy, et cetera. So there's a lot of places to get educated. The last thing I would say for any good therapist to do is to confront your own bias around the issue. Where did I get my knowledge from? What am I unsure of? What are my preconceived notions? How would this not be a safe place for my clients if I were to use this language or say these things? At what level am I asking my client to educate me in order to provide them with therapy? Should I be referring out because I'm not competent in working with multi-partnered systems, or should I become more educated? Is that discrimination? Is that just another no? All of those are really important things to think about for the therapist.
Coreen, what is the best way for listeners to get in touch with you, or if there are listeners who are interested in possibly working with you, where can they find you?
The best way would be my email. I am here at UNLV in the Marriage and Family Therapy Program, and my email is my first name, Coreen, Coreen, the last name Haym, M as in Mary, at unlv.edu.
Coreen, thank you so much for taking the time to share your expertise, your insights.
Oh, you're so welcome.
And doing it in such a compassionate way. I know that the information you shared is really going to open a lot of eyes, clarify things, and hopefully just help teach the world in general a little bit more meaningful and accurate information about BDSM.
Well, thank you so much, Lourdes. It was really a pleasure to do the interview with you.
Take care.
Okay, bye.
Bye. Wow, I learned so much in this conversation. A few things that surprised me but also made sense. One of them was just how significant the role of communication is in the BDSM world, specifically in negotiating consent, what is okay, what's not, and the amount of energy, time, and focus that is spent on this aspect of the BDSM experience. Another aspect that surprised me but made sense was the connection between being in a place of vulnerability, which means you are also feeling safe, and the potential intimacy that this can generate. That was just surprising and unexpected to think that would happen, because when you look at a BDSM experience from the outside, it can appear, I guess, not what we would expect when we think of intimacy or closeness. Another thing that stood out for me was how Coreen shared that the power dynamics are overt in BDSM. They're talked about, they're put out in the open. And that's different from more traditional relationships or traditional sexual encounters, in that in those relationships, the power dynamics are not talked about. They may not be acknowledged, or they may be hidden, or those involved may not even really be aware of them on a conscious level. For show notes to today's episode, please visit www.lourdesviado.com/women in depth, where you will find links to the resources mentioned. Thank you so much for listening, and see you next time.